Over here at Developer Voices, we're very interested in the future of software. Where are we trying to get to as an industry? What do we think tomorrow will look like? What do we think it should look like? But that doesn't just mean looking at the new and shiny stuff. At least it shouldn't. It also means taking a look at tools that have been with us for a while and asking how they're evolving, how they are moving us forwards. Which leads me to wonder about one of my favourite and staple databases, Postgres. It's been an exceptionally high-quality, free relational database for decades now. And it could rest on its laurels. It's definitely earned it, but it hasn't been. So what's new? Joining me to answer that question is Raouf Chebri. He works at Neon, which is a Postgres as a service platform, and we catch up a bit on the state of Postgres and what's new, and then we have a look at how Neon are trying to move the state of the art forward. They've been diving into the guts of Postgres, adding a bit of custom Rust code, doing some architectural tricks that will be familiar if you know how Kafka works, and they've ended up with a version of Postgres that starts to look a little bit like Git. The promise of a database that you can easily and cheaply feature branch. Things like that. How can you have multiple versions of the same source database doing different tasks? It's interesting. It really caught my attention when I tried it out last month. So I thought we'd bring Raouf in for the what, why, and how of what they've been doing. So, I'm your host, Chris Jenkins. This is Developer Voices. And today's voice is Raouf Chebri. My guest today is Raouf Chebri. Raouf, how are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks. Thanks for having me, Chris.
Absolute pleasure. You're coming to us live from Switzerland, I believe.
Yes, from beautiful Geneva.
Oh, very nice. I've only been there a couple of times, but it is beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah. So I've brought you in because you are on my grapevine, one of my resident Postgres experts, and you work for Neon. They've been doing some really interesting stuff with Postgres. We're going to get into that. Mm-hmm. But I have a confession. I haven't having loved Postgres in the past, I haven't had much excuse to use it for a couple of years. So catch me up. What have I missed? What's new?
Postgres just has been this open source database, relational database for decades. And now it's in version 15. And I think one of the reasons that you should pay attention to Postgres and the evolution of Postgres is, well, first of all, it's really the only true open source database. It's not owned by anybody. It's really owned by the community and very active community of contributors who are always striving to making it better, improve performance, adding more features. And I think what's interesting about Postgres is the growth of the community. So according to the Stack Overflow survey, Postgres is the most wanted database among professional developers. And I think also according to DB Engine, among the top 5 databases, Postgres is the only one that is growing. As opposed to, if you take MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, or even MongoDB, they're all declining, but Postgres is growing. And I think it's really because of its ecosystem. And what I mean by ecosystem, there are two things I mean by that. First of all is the ecosystem of extension. So Postgres is very versatile. It's not just a relational database, but it has all these extensions that give it superpowers. For example, we have PostGIS that allows you to do a geolocation, and you have Timescale that helps you to do time series. Or now the hot topic is AI. We have PG Vector, which allows you to do similarity analysis among vectors, which is something that you really need if you're using large language models like GPT. So I think it's just that there are so many things that you can do with Postgres apart from just storing data. But also, there are so many vendors who are who have their own Postgres offering. So you have AWS, you have Heroku, and you have countless others. You have backended services. You have distributed SQL. So it's not just this database that is a standalone and works on bare metal, but you can have it as managed service. You can have it as distributed service, and now you have it as a serverless database with Neon.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you this later, but I'm going to pull this question sooner in my mind because you're a developer advocate for Neon Postgres service, right?
Mm-hmm.
Surely that must make life hard because there are a lot of places you can get Postgres. How on earth do you distinguish yourself among the many, many Postgres services?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that we positioned ourselves quite early as the database for developers, and I think like the Neon architecture also helps a lot to differentiate ourselves from all the other vendors. And I think what helps us to be competitive in that space is that you can get a connection string very quickly, and the onboarding process is quite easy. So I think that I think for developers who are just looking for a database, who are just looking for a connection string, you can get started with Neon in a few clicks. So that definitely is something that helps. But what makes us different? I think it's our ecosystem of partners, and we partnered recently with Vercel. We partnered also with Hasura, with Replit, and obviously that gives us access to that developer community, and it just makes the conversation easier. So we're not necessarily talking to DBAs who want to manage their database themselves. We want to be the database for developers, and I think that's what makes us stand out from the rest.
Okay, that feels like a bit of a marketing headline, the database for developers.
Yeah.
I'm going to challenge you on that. So
Okay.
I do think you have great developer experience, and I'm going to talk about that. But like, as a developer advocate, I've done that job. You're going to a conference. Postgres isn't the new and hip thing. There are lots of people talking about Postgres. What do you, Raouf Chebri, get up on stage and talk about to excite people about Postgres?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, what excites people about Postgres? Well, in my case, I think is the new things that you can do with Postgres, and I definitely forgot to mention branching in that story.
Oh yeah, we're going to get into that too. I know we've got a lot of topics to hit. Don't hit them all at once.
Right. Yeah. So part of it is, I think, because, well, Postgres has a great documentation. People can go and have a look at it. So they don't necessarily want to know about Postgres when they come to Neon. So they want to know about all the other stuff that we do. So how does the serverless architecture work? How does branching work? And branching is one of the things that we offer. So I think that what makes them excited is just how can they be more productive using Postgres? And I think that the whole developer workflow story is something that is quite new in the database world. We are accustomed to it with things like Git, where you can create a branch, you can merge it, and you can collaborate with dozens of other developers. But we've never really had that in the database world. Every time we wanted to collaborate using databases, it's just a painful process, to be honest. So I think what excites people the most when I talk about Neon, it's developer workflows, is the fact that you can create a branch in a matter of seconds, and you can prototype using a database that is hosted in the cloud. You can get a connection string very quickly. So yeah, I would say that's what I talk about mostly. And I try to listen to I try to listen to develop. I mean, you've done that for years, as you said. So you listen to developers, and every time they come up with a set of problems, and you try to be helpful, etc. And yeah, and this is how you find things to talk about.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. So we need to get into this whole thing of branching, but we need to get to the long way, because this is the thing that really caught my attention about Neon specifically. You have this thing, and it's kind of a hip phrase that lots of databases are saying, to separate storage from compute. Right.
Yes. Yes.
I've heard that in a few different places, including my Apache Kafka days, which are still close to my heart. What does that mean in terms of Postgres? What are Neon doing? Why do we care about separating storage and compute?
Well, we care about it because, like, if you want to offer a truly serverless serverless service, then you want to give developers the ability to spin up instances on demand.
Yeah.
But the problem with that, as you may know, is when you're dealing with databases, you're dealing with stateful environments, and those are quite hard to manage because, well, every time you want to kill an instance, you need to make sure that that data doesn't disappear. You need to move it around. And what happens if you have an application that needs that data? So it turns out that managing a stateful instance is actually quite a hard problem, and this is why separating storage and compute comes into play and makes things a little bit easier. So in our case, when we talk about separating storage and compute, is we've taken Postgres and we added a patch that is about 1,000 lines of code that, and all that patch does is give Postgres the ability to talk to our storage engine that we built from scratch and we built with Rust. So there are really two components to that, and that separation gives a lot of benefits. And one of them is that since we don't have to deal with all the access to the file system, etc., then it allows Neon to spin up a Postgres database within seconds as opposed to minutes. So you go to Neon, you create a project, and you have a connection string within 3 seconds. And
how does that actually work? How does writing a new file system driver mean you can spin up instances quickly?
So well, you don't have to deal with all those accesses to disk. So from what my understanding regarding Postgres, that helps boot up the Postgres instance quicker than as opposed to if you had to boot the entire Postgres engine. And sorry, what was I? So I was talking about one of the benefits of separating storage and compute. So one of it is that you spin up a Postgres database really quickly because you don't have to deal with the data yet. And the second the second advantage is that you can allocate resources independently. So you have that Postgres instance. If you need more RAM, more CPU, you just give it more RAM and CPU. If you want to take it down, you just do it. And this is what allows for things like auto scaling, and we have also scaling down to 0. So if your database is inactive for 5 minutes, then you just shut it down. So that's regarding the compute part. The storage part is something that we built from scratch. That is multi-layered, and it's a distributed system on itself. So we have a durability layer that we call safekeepers, and basically that layer makes sure that your data is always present. So if you insert a row, that is always going to be there. And you have what we call page servers that knows how to reconstruct your data from any given point in time. Because in Neon we don't save just the data; we save the history of the database. So
okay,
yeah, and that actually what allows for things like branching is because the page server just knows how to reconstruct the state of your database from any given point in time.
So you're doing like a git-like thing where Postgres tries to save some data and your file system layer intercepts that and says, I'm not going to do a destructive update. I'm going to keep it as a history of changes.
Yes. And,
so you can do
Postgres
point in time type.
Yeah, Postgres does that through write-ahead logs. And this is exactly what we save. So we save write-ahead log records. And those are immutable files. And actually the third part that I haven't spoken about is since those are immutable files, then we can offload everything to a cloud storage. And this is what we do. So we offload cold data to S3. And that saves up some money also to our end user.
Okay. This actually is reminding me a little bit like Kafka, where you make the write-ahead log basically more important in the architecture than it's previously been. Mm-hmm. It's not just for creating a backup copy or recovery. It's actually an active part of the idea of how this is going to work.
Right. Yes. Right.
So this feeds into this thing you can offer of branching whole databases to share with other developers. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, since you can do branching, we really think, like, our philosophy is that if you can, whenever you need a Git branch, you'll probably need also a database branch.
I could believe that, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, because like if you think of it from a developer's perspective, you have production environment, staging, and you have your development environment, and you have databases in all those environments. But you don't work by yourself, so you work in teams, and the more people you have, the higher the chance of breaking something, and especially at database level. So if you're all making changes, better make them in branches that are isolated, that are independent. All branches inherit data and schema from their parent branch. So one of the advantages is that you can create features that are actually using some production data, and I think in some cases that are features where you need proper testing against production data in order to make sure that it works properly. And then nowadays, what is interesting is that the staging environment is kind of dead too. People are using more preview environments. So you have these cool companies like Vercel who offers developers the ability to create preview environments for every time they create a PR. So if you submit your code in GitHub, you create a pull request, then you have an automatic environment that comes out of the box with it, and your stakeholders or your team members can just click a link, and they have this production like environment. You can have a look at it and see everything that happens. But that's great for front end. But what happens with the database? Well, we kind of we created an integration with Vercel that does that automatically. So with a few clicks, you can do that. And we also have our API and GitHub Actions that also allow you to do that. So it makes total sense to have a database every time you're creating a branch in Git. And this is how we go about it.
Okay, so I can actually see that being really useful because I've definitely used it in front end and it's incredibly useful. So you're saying you've got cheap branching, so I can do a cheap branch of the live data. You've got low compute costs if it's not being used. So right. So it doesn't cost me anything to have an extra database for every pull request until they're used.
So you can, so every time you create a branch, well, in the storage engine, you're just creating a pointer, so you have some metadata there, and you're creating also another compute instance to have access to it. You can also create a branch without having a compute, but you would use that like as some sort of backup if you need it. But yeah, so so you can literally have tens of branches, even more. You can have branch for every one of your team, and it's not gonna, and all you're gonna be charged for is really the delta between the branches. Not necessarily like the entire. It's not because I have 1 gig of storage in my main database that I'm going to replicate those every time I'm going to create the new branch.
Right. Could you also use this mechanism for like as a fallback, like when you do an upgrade in production? Could you say, I'm going to tag the database at this point in time, and oh dear, the upgrade went badly, I can roll back?
Well, you can do even better. You have the ability of doing time travel anytime, because I said that the storage engine stores all the wall records and knows how to reconstruct data from any given point in time. So let's say one of your engineers somehow decided to manually drop or delete some data, and they deleted the wrong data in the database.
Does happen, yes.
Well, then you can just you can just easily roll back, create a branch uh, from a pass point, and just say, hey, I need to have this state of the database from t-1, not t0, and it does it in a matter of seconds, and you get back all the lost data, and then you just swap compute instances, and that's it. So the backup system as it is now is pretty good. We're still adding more to it because we're getting feedback from hardcore Postgres users. But the story is quite simple for now.
What kind of feedback are you getting? Is it like really deep technical or usability or what?
Yeah, so I think so. I think like there are things that we're currently working on. So our developer workflow story is needs a merge, and it's something that we were working on. But regarding Postgres, like we're adding things like sharding, replicas, all those things are coming very soon. So we get those feedback all the time, and we're working on them every day to make sure that we get in par with everything that Postgres offers.
Okay, and because how much maintenance is that? You say it's like 1,000 lines of code at the core of this. Does that mean that your version of Postgres is very close to the latest?
No, it is the latest.
Okay.
We do that for every version of Postgres. So we started with version 14, and then when version 15 came out, we were among the first ones to offer it to everybody, because all we need to do is just to write that code in version 15, and now you can do that, and it's going to be the same thing with 16. So every time a new version of Postgres is going to come out, we're going to be behind by a week or so, maybe less. Maybe we're going to do it at the same time, because we have Postgres hackers within the team that are very, very close to the Postgres community, and that contribute all the time to Postgres. So
okay,
we can do that.
And they have a pretty good track record for doing like release candidates and stuff. So presumably you've got some warning. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. That actually sounds really handy. So let's talk about, speaking of handy, if I'm going to use it, I have kicked the tires on Neon. And I'm going to sound like this is a sponsored podcast now, but hand on heart, I haven't been paid to say this. You have a really, really good onboarding experience for a lot of software as a service companies could go to Neon and learn a lot to steal for their own service.
Well, I'm glad you like it.
I really did, yeah. It took me about 3 minutes from hearing about you to having a database table with data in that I was selecting out of.
Amazing.
Which is,
I love hearing that.
But I've worked with software as a service companies where that is the opposite of the experience, right? What's your secret sauce? What's your tip for getting good developer experience?
Secret sauce. I'm not sure if we have a secret sauce. I think we try to do what everybody does, which is listen to our users, or listen to developers, and we want to get better. I think that's what we try to do. Like if you've looked at the Neon console in the past few months, I've been around for less than 9 months, and I can tell you that a lot of changes happen already. Sometimes I have a look at the UI and I don't recognize it. Like things are added all the time, things are changed because we listen to our to our community. Sometimes we get constructive feedback, sometimes we get bad feedback, and we try or negative feedback rather, and we work with both. And I think we also are in a unique position where we have partners that come from the front end world. Partners like Vercel, Replit, they already offer a really, really good developer experience, and we get inspired by our partners to deliver as good of a UI as possible. And I'd say maybe like the third thing would be that we have a passionate team, and culturally within the company, like most of the conversations start with, does this make it easier for developers, or does it make it harder? So if it's harder for developers, then maybe you want to remove those frictions. But if it's easier, then maybe it's the way to go. So yeah, I think it's just listen to our developers and ask ourselves the right questions, and try to mimic the best.
So I'm going to have to push you on this because it seems
Okay.
like every company thinks they're doing that, but I think you're unusually successful at it. What's the management like? What's the structure for getting changes in?
I think maybe it starts also from the top. Like as I said, culturally, it's like that, and it's important if you have founders and if you have leadership team that think that this is something crucial. Because yeah, well, we're having this architecture, but we need to find a way to make it easy for developers also to use it. So I think that yeah, maybe it also comes from the from the top all the way to the rest of the team.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I could see if it's an actual priority for the management, that really changes things rather than being a lip service priority, which does
Correct.
happen. Does it also relate back to this thing you were saying where like there are a lot of Postgres service providers, so you must
Right.
know that you have to differentiate yourself.
Mhm.
And that onboarding experience, when you're in a difficult to differentiate market, that first half hour can make all that more difference.
Yeah, there's actually, yeah, I just remembered that there's a really really nice quote by our CEO, and it says on his Twitter. I yeah, I don't remember the quote itself, but basically is like, if when you have a 10x architectural advantage, and here he's talking about being serverless and all the things that we spoke about,
Hmm.
then the next thing you focus on is developer experience, and that's how you create the separation between yourself and the other companies. I don't quite remember the full quote, but it's an interesting one that you can find it on Twitter, Nikita Bays. I
I'll
think
uh,
yeah,
I'll hunt it down and stick it in the show notes so people can have the
yeah,
exact quote.
yeah,
But that, I guess, that does prove that right at the top you're thinking about developer experience,
absolutely,
which
yes.
is unusual in a lot of software as a service businesses. Okay, so give me a bit of your background. What brings you into a Postgres story?
Um, yeah, I honestly, I didn't necessarily think of myself. Uh, I didn't think that I would ever be working with the Postgres community. It's quite new to me. It's something that I'm learning. I worked as as a developer advocate and an evangelist a long time ago. So now it's for bigger companies. I worked in NoSQL, but it's just, I think it was just this. It was natural for me to work with Postgres because the community is asking for it, and people want it, and people want to learn more about it. So I felt like it was an exciting opportunity to be working with the Postgres community, and it is. So it's a great time to be within the Postgres ecosystem.
It is, yeah. From my experience, it's a nice community and it's a great general purpose database.
Right.
But if you've worked in the NoSQL world, right, then you've seen a few different databases. What do you
Mhm.
think Postgres's place is in the world where everybody's trying to vie for the database that's customized to a specific task?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's important as a developer advocate also to understand that there's no such thing as the best database, right? Like there's no such thing as the best tool. There's only like the best tool for your specific use case and for whatever you're doing. So I think that for some use cases, then NoSQL is great. For other use cases, maybe you would go for SQL. We know that for most cases, SQL is probably the way to go. Um, so, so I think that it's important to understand like what what your goals are. What is it that you're trying to optimize for, and what's the best tool to achieve that? When I was working in NoSQL before, we had a very format a database, and we would always compare it to other NoSQL databases, and we would know that there are use cases where maybe our database would be the best, and maybe there are other use cases where it would be just better to use MongoDB or whatever. So I think it's important in the database world to understand why you're doing things.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. As ever in programming, you've got to understand what your tool's good at. And I think you've got to have a few different things in your toolbox these days. Like, I would say everyone should know one relational database if they can, if they're at that stage in their career, but not just a relational database. The more different ways you've got of solving a problem, the better off you are.
Yeah. And I think you come from that Kafka world where I've seen a lot of architectures where you put Kafka in the center of everything, and then you have all these streams of data, and then you have Postgres, you have Mongo, you have ScyllaDB, you have like all sort of different databases that are just communicating with each other. And I think this is what smart teams do, is that they understand the pros and cons of every architecture, of every tool. And you need to know a relational database, but not just a relational database. Like, you need to understand the whole ecosystem as a whole and how things interact with each other, I think.
Yeah. Well, I can think of no better way to get started with a relational database than to start with Postgres. And I'll give you that plug. You've got a great way of starting with it. So, I think maybe it's time to let people go and kick the tires on your service if they're so inclined.
Yeah. Go for it. Neon.tech. Go have a look. And most importantly, if you have any feedback, please reach out. I'm on Twitter. We are on Twitter. We're pretty active. I'm Raouf Devrel. There's the Neon account, and we would love to hear from you. We're still young. We're learning, and we want to offer a great service that can help developers out there.
And it sounds like there's a decent chance your feedback will actually be acted on.
I think that's that's all we hope for.
Yeah. Raouf, thanks very much for talking to us.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me again.
Thanks, Raouf. And I'll say it one more time. This hasn't been sponsored by Neon. I was just really impressed by their service. So if you need a Postgres instance in the cloud, give them a try. Perhaps more generally, if you're working on a service aimed at developers and you want to see an example of really good onboarding, I would check them out for ideas to steal. Now, we may not be sponsored by Neon or by anyone else at the moment, but one day we will be. I don't want you thinking I've suddenly sold out. So this space is intentionally left blank for some rampant capitalism. More important than that is the currency of feedback. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a like or a rating or share it with a friend. Speaking of friends, if there's someone out there you think I should be talking to, you'll find my contact details in the show notes. And with all that said, until next time, I've been your host, Chris Jenkins. This has been Developer Voices with Raouf Chebri. Thanks for listening.